After the storm, dark water churned beneath broken ice and the old wooden bridge. A former Navy SEAL diver heard 3 slow scratches where only debris should have been. Inside an overturned boat, he found a German shepherd holding her puppy above the freezing water. He brought both dogs ashore, warmed them, and stayed as the exhausted mother guarded her young. Then their elderly owner warned that the boat was not the real danger beneath the reservoir. With snowmelt rising, could one forgotten waterline threaten every home below the dam? Where are you watching from today? Stay until the end, share your thoughts, and please like and subscribe as we work toward our first 1,000 subscribers. The storm had moved east before dawn, but Pineglass Reservoir was still carrying its weight. Thin sheets of ice knocked against the pilings of the old timber bridge. Snow covered the cabin roofs around the mountain village and brightened the ridgelines beyond the lake. Yet the water beneath Luke Danner's boots remained black, restless, and cold enough to punish a mistake. Luke was 49, a former Navy SEAL who now inspected bridge foundations, intake gates, and submerged structures for the Pineglass Maintenance District. He had built his second life around procedures because procedures did not panic, forget, or change their minds halfway through a dangerous job. Years earlier, during his military service, one man had altered a planned route to help someone in trouble. The decision saved one life and injured another when the team lost control of its formation. Luke had carried the lesson home in a form harder than wisdom. He had come to believe that keeping people safe required keeping every decision inside firm hands, preferably his own. That morning, his purpose seemed simple. He and dive supervisor Aaron Holt had to make sure the storm had not shifted the bridge supports or driven debris into the nearby waterworks. No rescue had been reported. No one was supposed to be missing. Aaron stood at the edge of the maintenance dock in a teal rescue jacket, one gloved hand resting on the communication line. Her short, brown-gray curls showed beneath a charcoal cap, and the small laminated safety cards clipped to her belt moved in the wind. "You checked the harness twice," Aaron said. Luke tightened the last buckle on his charcoal dry suit. "3 times. That sounds more like you." Luke glanced toward the bridge. The old timbers were dark with meltwater, and a broken pine limb had lodged against the upstream side. Everything above the surface looked tired, but stable. He lowered his mask. Aaron's voice followed through the headset as he stepped down into the reservoir. "Inspect the north pilings first, then the intake side. Do not chase anything the storm left behind unless it threatens the structure." Luke gave a brief acknowledgement and descended. Cold water pressed against the suit. The sounds of the dock softened until Aaron's voice, his own breathing, and the faint movement of the guide rope became the whole world. Visibility was poor. Snowmelt and storm runoff had filled the water with silt, needles, and strips of bark. Luke's lamp opened only a narrow tunnel ahead of him. At 3 meters, the first piling appeared. He checked the timber face, the metal brace, and the stones around the base. No major shift. A second piling showed fresh scraping but no fracture. Luke marked it for later review and moved towards the old intake side. Then his light caught a white surface where no white surface belonged. Luke angled the beam. A small cabin boat lay overturned among several submerged branches. The bow had sunk into the mud, while the stern rested higher, held by the fork of a fallen tree. One rear corner of the hull pointed toward the surface. The boat had not been swept there years ago. Its paint was too clean beneath the silt, and the broken branches around it still showed pale wood. Luke checked the distance to the bridge. The boat was close enough to become a hazard if the current shifted again. He reached for a marker tag. 3 slow sounds came from inside the hull. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Luke stopped moving. The lake seemed to close around the sound. His own breathing filled the mask. A loose branch tapped the hull once, but the earlier rhythm had not been a branch. "Aaron," Luke said through the communication line, "hold surface movement." Aaron immediately quieted the crew on the dock. "What do you have?" Luke turned his helmet slightly and listened. The scratching came again, weaker this time. He moved toward the rear cabin window, clearing mud from the glass with one gloved hand. At first, the light showed only brown water and a tilted seat. Then 2 amber eyes opened behind the glass. Luke's chest tightened. A female German shepherd stood inside the overturned cabin, balanced on the side of a passenger bench that had become a narrow ledge. Her black and gold coat was soaked flat along her legs and belly. Her muzzle was lifted into a small pocket of air trapped beneath the cabin roof. Across her shoulders lay a tiny German shepherd puppy. The puppy could not have been more than 8 weeks old. Its dark body trembled against the mother's neck, one soft ear folded inward. The mother had raised her chest and shoulders as high as possible, using her own body to keep the puppy's nose above the cold water. Luke had seen courage dressed in uniforms, work coats, and ordinary clothes. He had rarely seen it look this tired. "We have 2 live dogs inside," he told Aaron. "Adult female and a young puppy. The adult is holding the puppy in an air pocket." Aaron's reply came after one controlled breath. "Can you access them?" "Not safely yet. The hull is carrying weight on the rear branches." Luke studied the window. Breaking it would be fast, but speed was not the same as rescue. The remaining air could escape. Water could rush through the opening. The hull might roll, crushing the narrow space that had kept both animals alive. The shepherd watched him through the muddy glass. She did not bark. She did not strike the window. She only held the puppy higher. That restraint made the situation feel more urgent, not less. Luke asked Aaron to send down 2 lifting lines. While the surface crew prepared them, he moved around the boat, checking where the hull touched the tree and where the mud supported the bow. The adult dog followed his light with her eyes. "I know," Luke murmured, though she could not hear the words through the water and glass. "I see you." The first line descended. Luke fixed it around the stern support and secured a second line farther forward. Aaron ordered the winch crew to take only enough attention to prevent movement. The boat settled against the lines. Luke tested the rear door. Mud packed the lower hinge, but the upper edge rested within the trapped air zone. He cleared the seal slowly, stopping whenever the hull creaked. Inside, the shepherd shifted one paw and nearly lost her footing. The puppy slipped lower against her neck. Luke held still until she regained balance. For the first time that morning, procedure did not feel like a wall between him and life. It felt like a promise. No sudden movement, no frightened decision, no careless hand, taking away the little air they had left. The rear door opened several inches. A thin stream of bubbles escaped, then stopped. The air pocket held. Luke widened the gap and reached inside with one hand, held low. The shepherd bared no teeth. Her body remained rigid, but her eyes stayed on his faceplate. He touched the puppy first. The tiny body was cold even through his glove. Luke eased one arm beneath its chest and lifted it from the mother's shoulders. The adult dog leaned toward the puppy, but did not interfere. She was allowing him to take her young first. Luke secured the puppy against his chest and backed through the door. "Puppy is out," he told Aaron. "Bring the recovery sling down." The sling reached him moments later. Luke placed the puppy inside, closed the support straps, and watched the small bundle rise toward the gray light above. Only then did he return for the mother. The shepherd had lowered her head, but she still stood inside the air pocket. When Luke extended his hand, she moved backward. "No," he said softly. "Your turn." The dog looked past him toward the dark front of the cabin. A low sound came from her throat. It was not aggression. It was a tired, pleading note directed toward the submerged seats ahead. Luke followed her gaze. Someone might still be inside. The safe choice for the dog was to remove her immediately. The complete choice was to understand why she refused. Luke moved farther into the cabin. He searched beneath the tilted passenger bench. Empty. He swept his light across the floor, where loose tools and a life jacket had collected against the dashboard. No person lay there. He checked the narrow storage space, the driver's position, and the dark water beneath the collapsed steering console. Nothing. The adult shepherd watched every movement. Luke reached the bow and touched the front wall, so she could see that he had gone as far as the cabin allowed. Then he returned, sweeping the light once more through each corner. "No one else," Luke said. "I checked." The shepherd could not understand the sentence, but she understood that he had looked. Her shoulders lowered. Luke placed one hand beneath the strap across her chest. This time, she allowed him to guide her through the rear door. When they reached open water, her legs stopped working. Luke held her against him as Aaron lowered the second sling. The dog rested her muzzle against his forearm, not in trust yet, but in exhaustion. At the surface, cold air struck harder than the water. Aaron and 2 crew members pulled the shepherd onto the dock. The puppy was already wrapped in heated blankets near the equipment shelter. Its small chest moved quickly, and one paw twitched against the cloth. The mother tried to stand. Aaron crouched beside her. "Easy, girl. Your puppy is here." The shepherd dragged herself one body length across the dock until her nose touched the blanket around the puppy. Only then did she lie down. Luke climbed from the lake, water running from his dry suit. He had expected relief. Instead, he felt the unsettled weight of the empty cabin. 2 dogs had been trapped in the overturned boat. Their owner hadn't been inside. While the animals were warmed, the crew stabilized the boat and began recovering loose objects from the cabin. The first was an old brass plumb bob, worn smooth around its pointed base. The second was a maintenance notebook sealed inside a clouded waterproof pouch. The third object was a coil of orange warning line. A crewman set all 3 on the dock beside Luke's tool case. The female shepherd lifted her head from beneath the warming blanket. Her strength appeared nearly gone, yet the sight of the orange line changed her. She planted one forepaw, then the other, and struggled upright. Luke moved to stop her from falling. The shepherd ignored his hands. She crossed the short distance to the coil, lowered her nose, and pushed the orange line across the wet boards until it touched Luke's boot. Then she looked toward the lake. A vehicle horn sounded from the snowy access road. Several villagers had found an elderly man farther along the shoreline, half sheltered among reeds and storm-thrown branches. The medics brought him toward the dock on a wheeled stretcher. He was 79, thin beneath a wet brown coat, with white hair pressed against his forehead. His name was Earl Benton, the former maintenance keeper for the Pineglass Dam. The female shepherd tried to go to him, but her legs folded. Luke caught her before she struck the boards. Earl opened his eyes at the sound of her strained whine. His gaze moved from the dog to the puppy, then to the brass plumb bob and the waterproof notebook. When he saw the orange warning line resting against Luke's boot, the confusion left his face for one clear and frightened moment. Earl reached weakly toward the reservoir. "It wasn't the boat," he said, each word fighting the cold in his lungs. "Something is pulling under the old house." Beyond the dock, the black water pressed against the bridge pilings. Under the warming blanket, the shepherd kept her eyes on the lake. By the time the ambulance reached the Pineglass clinic, evening had settled over the village. Snow lay in smooth white bands along the road, broken only by tire tracks and the dark runoff moving beneath the pines. The clinic stood beside the volunteer fire station, a low brick building with yellow light in its windows and a brass bell above the entrance that rang whenever the wind pushed hard enough. Earl Benton was taken inside beneath heated blankets. Hazel and Tuck remained in the warmed ambulance bay after a county veterinarian examined them. The puppy's temperature had begun to rise, and no serious injury had been found. Hazel was exhausted, but she refused to sleep unless her body faced the door through which Earl had disappeared. Luke Danner noticed that. He had changed out of his dry suit and into his usual dark olive t-shirt, blue-gray cargo pants, and a charcoal overshirt. His hair was still damp. A pale mark from his mask crossed the bridge of his nose. Erin Holt stood beside him with her teal rescue jacket open and her safety card still clipped at her belt. Neither of them had left because Earl's warning had changed the day's purpose. Something was pulling beneath the old house. The problem was that Earl could not explain what he meant. Inside the treatment room, the 79-year-old man drifted between sleep and confusion. At one point, he asked whether the north gate had been secured. A few minutes later, he looked toward the empty chair beside his bed and asked why Rose had not brought his dry socks. Rose Benton had been dead for 4 years. Dr. Alice Kern did not correct him harshly. Alice was 62, thin and straight-backed, with a silver blonde bob ending at her jaw. She wore pale blue scrubs beneath a burgundy cardigan, and a small white medical watch was clipped to her pocket. Her voice carried the firmness of someone who had spent decades explaining difficult truths without making them crueler. She warmed Earl slowly, monitored his breathing, and asked the same orientation questions at careful intervals. His answers improved, then slipped again when exhaustion pulled him under. Outside the room, news moved through Pineglass faster than the snowplows. Earl had taken a boat out after the storm. Earl had nearly frozen. 2 dogs had been trapped underwater. By nightfall, the story had already divided the village into 2 kinds of concern. Some people spoke of Earl with tenderness, remembering the years he had repaired valves in freezing rain and cleared branches from culverts before anyone else noticed the water rising. Others lowered their voices and said age had finally caught him. No one meant to be unkind. That was what made it dangerous. Concern could erase a person as gently as snowfall covered a road. By morning, everyone could agree the road was gone, without remembering that it was still there underneath. Luke stood near the clinic window, while Erin spoke with Alice in the hallway. He could see Hazel through the glass door to the ambulance bay. The German shepherd lay curled around Tuck, but her amber eyes remained open. Erin returned and told Luke that Alice intended to observe Earl through the night. Luke nodded. His knowledge may still help, but he should not make any more decisions around that lake. The words came easily because they sounded responsible. Erin did not answer at once. Luke continued, saying the dam operator, the dive team, and county personnel would handle any inspection. Earl could describe what he remembered, but people trained and currently authorized for the work would decide what happened next. From the treatment room, a bedsheet moved. Luke turned. Earl was awake. The old man's eyes were clearer than they had been at the dock. His face was still pale, and his white hair lay untidily across his forehead. But there was nothing confused in the way he looked at Luke. Earl had heard every word. He did not argue. He simply turned his face toward the wall. That silence followed Luke into the ambulance bay. Hazel raised her head as he entered. Tuck slept beneath her front leg, one folded ear twitching when a heater clicked on. The orange warning line rested on a shelf beside the brass plumb bob and the waterproof maintenance notebook. All 3 items had been cleaned, dried, and placed where Earl could see them later. Luke picked up the orange coil. Hazel stood immediately. Her legs trembled, but her attention sharpened. She crossed the few feet between them and touched the line with her nose. Luke set it down again. Hazel pushed it toward the door. Erin watched from behind him. That is the same thing she did on the dock. It could be association, Luke said. She sees something familiar and expects Earl. That may be all it is. Erin's agreement should have satisfied him. Instead, Luke looked back toward the treatment room. Earl's silence had not sounded like surrender. It sounded like a door being closed from the inside. Alice kept Earl overnight. Before sunrise, the storm clouds finally broke apart. Pale light spread across Pineglass, revealing snow-heavy roofs, the dark line of the reservoir, and steam rising from the clinic's heating vents. When Alice repeated her questions that morning, Earl gave his full name, the correct date, the location, and the name of the president. He described the accident in order. He remembered who had found him and where his boat had been recovered. Alice then asked about Rose. Earl closed his eyes. "My wife has been gone 4 years," he said. "Last night, I forgot that for a little while." Alice placed her pen on the chart. She did not soften the answer for the people waiting nearby. Earl's confusion, she explained, was consistent with cold exposure, exhaustion, and shock. It did not prove permanent cognitive decline. At that moment, he understood his circumstances and could participate in decisions. Then Alice turned directly to Earl. Participation did not mean returning to the lake. She forbade him from boarding a boat, standing outside for long periods, or doing physical work near the reservoir until she cleared him. He could provide knowledge after rest, but someone else would carry the risk. Earl gave one reluctant nod. Luke had expected Alice's assessment to confirm his own judgment. Instead, it drew a line he had not considered. Earl had limits. He had not lost his voice. Later that morning, Earl sat in a chair near the clinic's front window, wrapped in a gray blanket. Hazel rested across his feet. Tuck slept in a padded box close to the radiator. The brass plumb bob hung from Earl's fingers. Its metal surface was scarred from years of use, and a faint inscription ran around its wider end. Luke had to lean closer to read it. "For the man who always finds the way to bring people home." Earl noticed him reading. "Rose gave me that the day I retired," Earl said. His voice remained rough, but the words came steadily. "She said I had spent enough years checking whether everything else was level. It was time to check myself." A brief warmth passed through his expression and disappeared. Luke asked him to explain the orange line. Earl rested the plumb bob in his palm before answering. Hazel had followed him during inspections for years. She had learned the sounds of the lake's working parts, not by understanding machinery, but by repetition. When submerged branches struck old metal, the vibration traveled through dock boards and shoreline platforms. Loose cable made a different sound. Timber pressed against a grate produced a slow knock that could sometimes be felt through the soles of a person's boots. Earl had trained Hazel to bring the orange line whenever she reacted to those familiar vibrations. "She does not know what is under the water," Earl said. "She knows when the water sounds wrong." 3 times before the storm, Hazel had carried the line to him. Earl had also felt a low trembling beneath the floor of the old maintenance house beside the reservoir. The building no longer served the dam, but its foundation stood over buried pipes and older service channels. He had called the operating station. No one answered. Aaron explained that the storm crew had been dealing with power interruptions and a damaged weather sensor on the opposite side of the reservoir. The missed call had not been deliberate. Earl accepted that, but he did not excuse his own decision. He had imagined timber or cable collecting near an outlet. With heavier snowmelt expected later in the week, anything caught there could become harder to remove. He also imagined calling again and hearing patience in someone's voice, the careful patience reserved for children, grieving people, and old men believed to be confused. So he went out to find proof. Earl described taking Hazel because she knew the inspection route. Tuck had been asleep beneath a bench when they left, and Earl had not noticed the puppy until the boat was already away from shore. Near the old bridge, a floating trunk struck the side of the cabin boat. Earl lost his footing and went into the reservoir. The current carried him through a gap between storm-thrown branches and pushed him toward the eastern shore. The boat drifted away before he could reach it. He remembered Hazel barking once. Then the cold had taken the edges from everything. Earl looked down at the dog lying across his boots. "I promised Rose I would never go out there alone in winter," he said. She knew I had a talent for calling pride responsibility. No one rushed to fill the quiet that followed. Luke understood the sentence more than he wanted to. Earl had not gone onto the lake because he lacked all judgment. He had gone because fear and pride had joined hands. He feared the warning would be ignored, and he needed to prove that age had not made him useless. Understanding the motive did not make the choice safe. Luke still believed Earl should be kept away from the operation. Earl turned the brass plumb bob between two fingers. He spoke briefly of his years in an Army engineering unit, when men learned to build temporary crossings and move heavy loads with whatever rope, timber, and patience they had. "People think a line fails because it was weak," Earl said. "Most times, it fails because everybody made it carry the whole load." Luke heard the lesson, but did not answer. He was watching Hazel. At the mention of the secondary outlet, the German shepherd lifted her head. She looked first toward Earl, then toward the orange warning line on the nearby table. Hazel rose, took 2 stiff steps, and pushed the coil across the tabletop with her nose until part of it dropped against Luke's hand. She did not paw at the door or become frantic. After touching the line, she looked toward the reservoir beyond the window. The warning had not ended, simply because Earl had been found. Before Luke could respond, the clinic's front door opened. Mark Dorsey entered carrying a rolled weather report beneath one arm. At 56, the Pineglass dam operator had a broad face, thinning sandy gray hair, and rectangular steel-framed glasses. A red carpenter's pencil rested behind his right ear. Snowmelt darkened the shoulders of his blue work jacket. Mark had come from the control station. He spread the report across Alice's reception counter and explained that warm air had moved over the upper ridges sooner than forecast. Snowpack readings were already rising. The dam would have to begin releasing water within 48 hours. Mark removed his glasses and looked from Earl to Luke. "If the secondary outlet is restricted," he said, "the reservoir will send that extra water somewhere else." No one in the room needed a map to understand where. Below the dam, a low county road crossed the river. Beyond it stood a row of wooden houses occupied by families who had lived in Pineglass for generations. Hazel remained beside the orange line. Outside the clinic window, sunlight touched the snow-covered mountains, while dark water moved beneath the ice. The first sonar pass began before noon. 48 hours remained before Pineglass Reservoir would have to release water, and the morning cold had already begun to soften. Snow slid from the lower roofs in wet sheets. Along the mountain slopes, narrow silver streams appeared between the pines, where there had been only white the day before. Erin Holt organized the survey from the maintenance dock. She divided the work into 3 clear parts. Mark Dorsey would provide the current dam maps and pressure readings. The sonar crew would search the area Earl Benton had identified, and Luke Danner would compare anything they found with the bridge inspection from the previous day. There would be no guessing. There would also be no Earl on the water. Dr. Alice Kern had allowed him to attend for 90 minutes, provided he remained warm and did not leave the rescue vehicle parked beside the dock. Earl sat near the open side door in a thick brown cardigan, a blanket across his knees, and the brass plumb bob in one hand. Hazel lay across his boots. The German shepherd was still recovering from the overturned boat. Her movements remained careful, and the fur along her legs had not regained its full shape. She wore her old brown leather collar, but no working harness. Erin had made it clear that no one was to treat her like a search dog. Tuck remained at the clinic. The puppy was warm and eating, but the sound of metal equipment still made him retreat into the back of his recovery pen. Earl had accepted that decision more easily than the order keeping him off the lake. Luke stood beside the sonar monitor in the aluminum workboat. His dark olive shirt showed beneath a charcoal winter shell, and his rust-orange watch band was the only warm color against the gray water. Mark unfolded a laminated engineering map over the console. The current secondary outlet appeared as a clean blue line running from the west side of the reservoir toward the control structure. The intake screen was marked by a black rectangle. Depth numbers, service dates, and inspection notes filled the margins. Mark tapped the location Earl had described. "This is where the active screen sits," he explained. "If timber collected there, sonar should show it." Luke studied the map, then looked toward the rescue vehicle. Earl had marked nearly the same location in his old notebook, though his drawing used shoreline trees and bridge supports instead of modern coordinates. Aaron gave permission to begin. The boat moved slowly across the reservoir, while the sonar unit sent sound beneath the surface. On the monitor, the lake bottom appeared in bands of shadow and pale reflection. Rocks formed hard, bright edges. Silt showed as soft gray. A few branches lay scattered near the old spillway, exactly where a storm would leave them. The first pass crossed the northern edge of the outlet screen. Nothing large appeared. The second pass covered the southern edge at a tighter interval. The screen stood clear, except for two small limbs lodged against its upper corner. Neither was large enough to restrict meaningful flow. Luke asked the crew to reduce speed and repeat the center line. They did. Again, the monitor showed no cable bundle, no trunk, and no mass of storm debris. Mark compared the sonar image with pressure readings from the control station. The numbers were not perfectly smooth, but nothing suggested a blocked outlet. The minor changes could be explained by runoff, wind pressure, or shifting debris elsewhere in the reservoir. After the fourth pass, Aaron asked Luke for his assessment. "The marked area is clear enough for the planned release," Luke said. "We should remove the two branches, but there is no major obstruction here." Earl could hear the exchange through the radio placed beside him in the rescue vehicle. He did not interrupt. Mark joined him on shore and explained the findings without impatience. He showed Earl printed images from the sonar screen and pointed out the outline of the modern intake grate. "We searched the position you gave us," Mark said. "There is nothing there large enough to cause the vibration you described." The words were respectful. The evidence was real. That made them harder to challenge. Earl looked at the image for a long time. Hazel lifted her head against his knee, but he did not touch her. Mark added that storm noise sometimes traveled through old foundations in misleading ways. The vibration Earl felt beneath the maintenance house could have come from debris striking another part of the shoreline. Earl nodded slowly. "Then I may have put you all through this for nothing." Aaron told him the survey had not been wasted. The outlet needed checking after the storm regardless. Earl gave her a faint smile, but the reassurance did not reach him. He lowered his gaze to the brass plumb bob and rolled it between his fingers. "Maybe I was trying to keep a job that ended a long time ago," he said. Luke heard the sentence from several feet away. The old man did not sound self-pitying. That would have been easier to resist. He sounded as if he were making room inside himself for everyone else's conclusion. The sonar crew began coiling cables. Mark returned to the console to save the survey data. Aaron reviewed the weather schedule and confirmed they would remove the two small branches the next morning. The work had reached a reasonable end. Luke believed in reasonable endings. He walked to the rescue vehicle to collect Earl's maintenance notebook. The old drawings would be photographed and filed, even if they no longer matched the active system. Hazel rose before Luke reached the door. She did not look at him. Her head turned towards the old timber bridge, well east of the area the sonar boat had searched. Beneath the bridge's southern side, a rust-dark service pipe disappeared into the stone abutment. The visible section had been listed as inactive for years and did not connect to the modern secondary outlet on Mark's map. Hazel stared toward the shadow beneath that bridge. Earl noticed her attention. "Easy, girl." Hazel ignored the familiar calming words. The orange warning line rested inside the rescue vehicle beside Earl's seat. Hazel lowered her head, took took the coil gently between her teeth and stepped down onto the packed snow. Her legs remained unsteady, but her direction was clear. She crossed the stretch of shoreline beside the location the sonar crew had just searched. Then she continued toward the bridge. Luke caught up after several yards. "That is far enough." He took hold of Hazel's collar and guided her back from the icy edge. The dog resisted only by planting her front paws. She did not growl or pull wildly. Her body remained pointed toward the bridge, while the orange line hung from her mouth. Luke tightened his grip enough to keep her from moving forward. Hazel was still weak. She had spent hours in freezing water. Letting her wander across slick ground for the sake of an uncertain reaction would have been irresponsible. Earl watched from the vehicle. "You are not protecting her," he said. Luke looked back. Earl's voice had no anger in it, which gave the words more weight. "You are deciding she no longer knows anything." For a moment, Luke kept one hand on Hazel's collar. The sentence opened a memory he rarely entered willingly. Years earlier, his team had been approaching a damaged building along a planned route. One of the men broke formation after hearing someone trapped behind a collapsed wall. He changed direction without waiting for the others to reposition. The trapped man survived. Another member of the team was injured when the line of movement broke apart. Luke had remembered the event in one clean lesson. Plans kept people alive. Deviation invited loss. He had never allowed the lesson to become complicated. Now Hazel stood beneath his hand, not dragging him toward the lake, not asking him to trust a miracle. She was only facing a direction different from the one the map had approved. Luke released her collar. He did not let her continue to the water. Instead, he took the orange coil from her mouth and walked beside her toward the bridge, slowly enough that Earl could watch from the vehicle. Hazel stopped 20 feet from the southern abutment. Her ears turned toward the old pipe under the timbers. She held still. Luke listened. He heard ice tapping wood, water moving against stone, and a loose metal bracket knocking somewhere beneath the bridge. None of it proved anything. Hazel looked toward him, then back at the pipe. Luke returned her to Earl before the cold could weaken her further. He still agreed with the sonar results. He still believed the survey should end at the marked location. A dog's attention could not replace an image of the lake bottom. But Earl's question stayed with him. Was he protecting everyone from a bad decision, or protecting himself from information that did not fit the plan? Luke went back to the boat. "The current data does not justify expanding the search," he told Aaron. "We should close this pass." Aaron studied him. "You sound less certain than the sentence. The marked outlet is clear." "That was not what I asked." Before Luke could answer, Mark's radio sounded from the console. The control station had recorded a brief vibration in the western pressure system. The reading lasted less than 4 seconds, then returned to normal. Mark pulled the digital report onto the monitor. The signal did not identify a location. It showed only that pressure had shifted somewhere within the connected system. The timing placed it within minutes of Hazel turning toward the bridge. Mark adjusted his glasses. "Storm debris could have settled," he said, "or ice moved against an old fitting." Both explanations were possible. Aaron told him to preserve the reading with the sonar files. She did not order another survey. She did not declare Earl correct. She simply refused to throw away a piece of information because it had arrived at an inconvenient time. That decision changed the mood on the dock. The sonar results still mattered. So did the unexplained vibration. So did the old man, whose memory had failed in one place and held firm in another. Earl opened his maintenance notebook again. Luke brought it to him and held the lower edge steady, while Earl turned the water-stained pages. Most of the drawings showed intake gates, shore markers, and measurements made long before digital mapping. Near the back, Earl stopped. A faded line ran beneath a sketch of the timber bridge. It crossed diagonally from the old maintenance house toward the southern abutment. Beside it was a symbol Luke did not recognize, a narrow triangle with 2 short marks beneath it. Earl touched the symbol with one finger. His face did not brighten with triumph. It tightened with concentration. "That was a service route," he said, "before the dam was rebuilt." Mark brought the modern map closer. No line crossed beneath the bridge. The old pipe shown in Earl's notebook did not appear as active, inactive, sealed, or removed. On the official map, it did not exist at all. Earl looked from the faded drawing to the bridge outside. "There used to be a maintenance line under those timbers," he said, "and somebody took it off the map." The old maintenance notebook spent the morning beneath 3 lamps. One light came from the Pineglass control room ceiling. Another came from the inspection table, where Aaron Holt had spread the pages beneath clear protective sheets. The third was the winter sun, pale and cold, entering through the high windows above the dam machinery. Outside, snowmelt moved down the mountain in narrow streams. Inside, Luke Danner tried to determine whether a line drawn 40 years earlier belonged to a real pipe or only to an old man's uncertain memory. Earl Benton sat at the far end of the table in a thick brown cardigan, his brass plumb bob resting beside his hand. Dr. Alice Kern had allowed him to remain for 2 hours, provided he stayed inside and rested whenever she told him to. Hazel lay on a folded blanket near the radiator. She had eaten that morning and walked without assistance, but no one asked her to perform, search, or demonstrate anything. Her work for the day was simply to remain close to Earl. Mark Dorsey placed the modern dam plans beside the open notebook. On the official drawings, the secondary outlet ran west of the old timber bridge. The area beneath the bridge showed a stone abutment, several abandoned conduits for electrical service, and nothing else. Earl's hand-drawn page showed something different. A narrow line crossed diagonally beneath the southern bridge, supports, and continued toward the old maintenance house. Beside it were faded depth numbers, the locations of 3 survey stakes, and a symbol shaped like a long triangle. Mark adjusted his steel-framed glasses. "You are certain that symbol means a service line?" Earl answered without defensiveness. "It meant a maintenance bypass. We used it when the main outlet needed inspection." Mark pointed to the dates printed on the modern map. "This system was rebuilt after you retired. The records say the bypass was permanently sealed." "They may be right," Earl said. The answer surprised Luke. Earl explained that during his final year at Pineglass, the old line had been closed with a temporary steel plate. The permanent work was scheduled as part of a larger renovation, but Earl retired before the project reached that section. Months later, he received a copy of the completion report. It stated that the bypass had been filled and sealed. He had accepted the report. "I knew the line existed," Earl said. "I believed it no longer carried water." That distinction mattered. It removed the easiest explanation, that Earl had forgotten part of the system he once maintained. He had not forgotten. He had trusted a record written after he left. Luke studied the damaged notebook page. Water had blurred the lower corner, where the original scale had been written. Several measurements remained legible, including the distance between 2 survey stakes and the angle from the bridge's southern abutment. Near the margin was a small, traced outline of Earl's brass plumb bob. Earl explained that the old maintenance crews sometimes traced a known tool on field sketches. Copies made on different machines could shrink or stretch, but the outline allowed workers to restore the original scale later. Luke picked up the real plumb bob and placed it over the faded tracing. The edges matched. Using the tool's known length and the surviving distance between the old stakes, Luke calculated the approximate scale of the page. Aaron entered the measurements into a mapping program, while Mark brought up archived construction photographs from before the renovation. One photograph showed the bridge from the west bank. Snow covered the shore, but beneath the southern span a dark, circular opening could be seen in the stone. Another image, taken during summer construction, showed workers lowering a steel plate near the same opening. There was no photograph of concrete being poured. There was no image of the line being filled. Mark searched the completion records again. The final inspection included a signed statement saying the bypass had been sealed, but the attached work log skipped from installation of the temporary plate to landscaping above the old maintenance trench. A finished sentence stood where several unfinished actions should have been. Luke did not treat that gap as proof. He asked Aaron to bring up the first sonar survey. They placed Earl's restored drawing over the modern map, then added the previous day's search lines. The sonar crew had searched the correct location for the active secondary outlet. They had not crossed the line beneath the bridge because the official map gave them no reason to do so. Mark added the western pressure reading. Aaron entered the point where storm debris had collected along the shoreline. Luke used the current direction recorded after the flood to estimate how a floating trunk might have moved once the water rose. The separate pieces remained uncertain. Together, they formed a narrow corridor running from beneath the timber bridge toward the old western chamber. Aaron leaned over the table, one hand resting beside her cobalt carabiner. "We have enough to verify," she said. "Not enough to assume." That was the kind of sentence Luke trusted. The second survey was approved as a limited technical pass. No divers would enter the water. The sonar boat would follow the reconstructed route once, then repeat only if the readings justified it. Earl remained in a temporary monitoring room on shore. A portable heater warmed the small space, and Alice had placed a kitchen timer on the desk to remind him when to rest. Hazel lay at his feet. Luke joined Aaron and Mark aboard the workboat. The modern map remained open beside the restored field drawing. For the first time, neither document was being asked to defeat the other. The boat moved east of the previous survey area. Luke watched the bridge supports approach. Meltwater dripped from the timbers, and broken branches turned slowly in the current below. The sonar screen showed the lake bottom rising beneath them. At first, there was only stone and silt. Then a hard line appeared. It ran beneath the southern abutment at an angle that matched Earl's drawing. Mark leaned closer to the screen. "There is a structure there." The boat continued. The hard line widened into a circular form, partly buried beneath sediment. Farther along, the image became confused by bright reflections and long shadows. Aaron ordered the operator to reduce speed. In the shoreroom, Hazel stood. Earl felt the movement against his chair and looked down. The German shepherd's ears pointed toward the reservoir. She did not touch the orange line resting on a shelf. She did not bark or strain for the door. She simply listened. A few seconds later, the sonar image sharpened. A long, reflective band curved around the submerged structure. Another shadow crossed it at an angle. Behind both lay a broader mass with an uneven surface. Luke identified the shapes in order: steel cable, timber, broken sections of planking. The objects had wrapped around a grate or frame at the end of the old line. Aaron ordered a second pass from the opposite direction. This time, the image showed the structure more clearly. A large tree trunk lay against the old intake screen. Several lengths of cable had looped around the trunk and caught pieces of bridge timber between them. Mark compared the depth with Earl's notebook. "The old bypass is still open to the reservoir." No one answered immediately. The truth was not that Earl's memory had defeated the sonar. The first sonar survey had been accurate. The active outlet was clear. Earl had also been accurate about the existence of the old route, though the storm had carried the obstruction away from the place where he first sensed it. The failure lay between those truths. The temporary steel plate had weakened over decades. The storm had torn part of it loose, allowing water to move through a line believed to be permanently closed. The altered flow then pulled timber and cable toward the forgotten screen. Memory had preserved the route. Modern instruments had revealed its present condition. Neither could have done the whole job alone. Luke looked through the boat window towards the shore room. Earl was visible behind the glass, one hand resting on Hazel's back. Until that moment, Luke had asked Earl only for details that fit questions Luke had already chosen. He picked up the radio. "Earl," Luke said, making sure the older man could hear him clearly. "If you were still responsible for this system, what would you inspect first?" The question changed the room on shore. Earl did not answer immediately. He looked at the sonar image transmitted to his monitor, then opened his notebook to the page showing the old elevations. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "Find where the cable is carrying the load. Do not start with the biggest piece of wood. Start with whatever is keeping it from moving." Luke wrote the answer down. He did not promise to follow it. He did not dismiss it either. That was the first honest space he had made between control and trust. The boat completed one final pass to establish the size of the obstruction. The tree trunk was longer than the intake screen and angled downward into the silt. At least 3 loops of cable appeared to hold it against the frame. Removing it would require more than a simple tow. Mark's radio sounded before the crew returned to shore. The mountain weather station had revised the temperature forecast. Warm air was moving across the upper slopes faster than expected, and the snowpack was already releasing more water into the feeder streams. The 48-hour window was gone. They had approximately 20 hours before the planned release could no longer be delayed safely. Aaron repeated the number so everyone heard it correctly. 20 hours. On the sonar screen, the cable bundle shifted. The tree trunk moved with it, sliding almost a meter closer to the forgotten intake screen before settling again. No one in the boat mistook the movement for a finished answer. The obstruction had been found. Now, it was moving. Earl Benton wanted to be on the boat. He made the request from a chair beside the Pineglass control room window, where the reservoir could be seen through bare trees and falling snow. The old man wore a cream Henley beneath a heavy brown cardigan. His brass plumb bob rested in one hand, and Hazel lay across his boots, as if guarding him from anyone who might decide his life without asking. Luke Danner refused before Earl finished explaining. "You are not going back onto that lake," Luke said. The answer was firm, immediate, and familiar. Luke had used the same tone underwater when equipment shifted or a diver's breathing changed. It was the voice he trusted when danger left no time for debate. Earl's expression hardened. "You asked what I would inspect," he reminded Luke. "Now you want me close enough to answer, but far enough that I cannot see." Luke stood beside the equipment table in his dark olive shirt and blue-gray cargo pants. His dry suit hung nearby, ready for the next descent. "You were pulled from freezing water less than 2 days ago," Luke said. "This is not punishment." Earl looked toward the reservoir. "No," he replied. "It is concern. That is what people call it when they take the choice away politely." The room fell quiet. Luke felt the words land near the same place as Earl's earlier accusation beside the dock. He could list every medical reason the old man should remain on shore. None of those reasons required pretending Earl had nothing useful to contribute. Aaron Holt stepped between the two positions before either man could turn them into walls. Earl would not board the boat. He would not enter the cold, approach the water, or direct the divers. Instead, he would remain inside the control room with access to the sonar feed, underwater camera, historic diagrams, and live load readings. Aaron made the limits plain. She alone would decide whether the divers entered or left the water. Mark Dorsey would control the valves and isolation system. Earl could advise, explain, and question, but he could not issue operational commands. Dr. Alice Kern agreed after examining Earl again. She placed a timer beside him and required a 10-minute rest every half hour. If his hands began shaking, his speech slowed, or his attention wandered, his participation would end. Earl accepted the terms. Luke did too, though acceptance came more easily to his mouth than to the part of him that still wanted every uncertain hand removed from the rope. The work outside had already grown beyond the dive team. Beth Kellen, the 58-year-old chief of Pineglass's volunteer fire crew, arrived with 2 trucks and 8 volunteers. Beth was a broad-shouldered black woman with short braids threaded with silver and a low voice that carried clearly through wind and machinery. She unfolded an evacuation map across the hood of a rescue vehicle. Her team would warn the families living below the dam, prepare barriers for the low county road, install floodlights along the shoreline, and assist with the shore winches. No one was being ordered from home yet, but everyone would know where to go if the release changed direction. "People handle bad news better when it arrives before the water," Beth said. Mark began isolating the forgotten maintenance line. The old bypass could not be trusted simply because the control panel labeled it inactive. He closed the connected gates, locked the operating handles, attached warning tags, and verified the position from both the panel and the mechanical indicators below. Aaron checked every step beside him. Only after pressure readings stabilized did the team lower a small current meter near the work zone. The instrument showed no meaningful pull toward the old screen. Mark read the result aloud. Aaron repeated it over the radio, so the divers and shore crew heard the same confirmation. The line was isolated. No water movement would be introduced again until every diver, tool, guide rope, and lifting sling had been accounted for. Luke sealed his dry suit and checked his harness. A second district diver entered beside him, carrying the underwater camera and a set of load-rated slings. Their job was not to cut anything. They would map the obstruction directly, attach lifting lines, test how the trunk responded to low force, and establish an escape route before anyone attempted removal. Luke descended through dark water toward the forgotten intake. The camera feed appeared on 3 monitors inside the control room. Earl leaned forward, then remembered Alice's instruction and settled back into his chair. Hazel rested her chin across his boot. The old bypass screen emerged from the silt below Luke. A tree trunk lay across it, longer than the grate, and nearly as thick as Luke's chest. Sections of broken bridge timber had been pulled beneath the trunk. Steel cable wrapped through the mass in 3 separate loops. The first loop crossed the upper face of the trunk. The second disappeared beneath the wood and returned along the grate. The third ran backward into the mud, where its anchor point could not be seen. From the camera angle, the cable did not look like loose debris. It looked loaded, every curve holding pressure somewhere else. Luke moved slowly around the obstruction. He placed numbered markers at each visible loop and used a handheld force gauge to test the tension without shifting the mass. Earl watched the readings appear on the control room display. "The outside loop is not holding the trunk," he said. "It is holding the other 2 apart." Mark looked over from the valve panel. "You can tell that from the picture?" Earl pointed to the direction of the cable bends, rather than asking anyone to trust his memory. During his years in an Army engineering unit, he had seen timber crossings fail when weight transferred through ropes in unexpected directions. The largest object was not always carrying the greatest load. Sometimes the smallest line kept the entire structure from changing shape. "If they pull the outer loop first," Earl explained, "the load will move into the line under the trunk." Luke heard him through the radio. He did not accept the judgment on faith. He positioned the force gauge against the lower cable and asked the shore team to place minimal tension on the upper sling. The change was small enough that the trunk did not move. The lower reading climbed immediately. Earl was right. Luke marked the result on his slate. "Outer loop stays," he told Aaron. "It is separating the load." Inside the control room, Mark looked at Earl differently, not with gratitude yet, and not with apology. He looked at him as one operator recognizes another person who understands what pressure can hide. The divers attached one lifting sling near the wider end of the trunk and another closer to the screen. A third safety line was set to limit rotation. Luke then cleared a retreat path between the obstruction and the stone wall. The route was narrow, but wide enough for both divers to leave without crossing beneath the suspended lines. When every attachment had been photographed and checked, Luke moved out of the immediate work area. Aaron authorized a low-force test. Beth's shore crew took their positions at the winches. Mark confirmed once more that the water system remained locked. Earl watched the force readings. Hazel slept beneath the table, her body finally relaxed in the warmth. The winch motors turned at their lowest setting. The first sling tightened. On the underwater camera, silt rose in a faint brown cloud. The trunk did not lift. One cable straightened several inches, then stopped. The force remained within the expected range. Aaron allowed another small increase. Hazel raised her head. The dog did not look toward the monitor. Her ears turned downward, toward the metal floor beneath Earl's chair. Then she stood. A low vibration moved through the room, too faint for most people to notice beneath the hum of equipment. Earl felt Hazel's shoulder brush his knee. He glanced down at her, then toward the load display. The reading on the northern sling was climbing faster than the other two. "Watch line 2, Earl said. His voice carried urgency, but he did not give an order. He pointed at the numbers and left the decision where it belonged. Mark leaned closer. The load had risen beyond the expected curve, even though the winch speed had not changed. Aaron saw the same thing. "Stop all winches," she ordered. Beth repeated the command outside. The motors fell silent. For 1 second, nothing moved. Then the underwater camera showed the far end of the tree trunk settling sideways. It had begun rotating toward the space Luke had marked as the diver's escape route. Luke saw it at the same time. "Both divers withdrawing," he reported. They followed the guideline away from the screen, while silt thickened behind them. The trunk shifted only a few inches more before the safety line caught it. No cable snapped. No one became trapped. The test had ended before a small change became an irreversible one. Once Luke and the second diver reached the surface, Aaron counted them, their tools, and every line attached to the work zone. Only then did the control room release the breath it had been holding. Luke returned inside with water running from his dry suit. His face was calm, but the tightness around his mouth showed that he understood how close the test had come to closing the retreat path. Earl did not say, "I warned you." He looked at the paused camera image and traced the angle of the trunk with one finger in the air. "The lower end is heavier than the sonar showed," he said. "It is buried in the mud. Pulling upward makes the other end swing." Mark brought a chair to Earl's side and sat down with the modern diagram between them. "What would keep it from turning into the exit?" Mark asked. The question was practical and direct. It was also the first time Mark spoke to Earl as a colleague rather than a source being evaluated. Together, they studied the screen, while Luke and Aaron reviewed the load records. The original plan, to lift the trunk away from the grate, was no longer safe. Earl suggested lowering one end deeper into the silt first. That would reduce the height of the obstruction and allow the entire trunk to rotate parallel to the old current path. Once aligned, the crew could guide it through the open space beside the screen rather than pulling against the cables. Luke checked the proposal against the camera images. It would be slower. It would require the shore crew to divide the load across several lines and adjust them in a precise sequence. But it would keep the trunk from sweeping across the diver's retreat route. Luke looked at Earl. For years, Luke had believed shared authority created gaps where danger entered. Yet the operation had not become weaker because Earl spoke, Mark measured, Hazel reacted, and Aaron decided. It had become harder for one person's blind spot to carry the whole weight. Mark's weather radio sounded. The latest runoff report left them approximately 3 hours before the release schedule reached its final safe limit. Aaron wrote the number across the planning board. The first method was finished. No one would attempt it again. On the center monitor, the tree trunk rested diagonally across the old screen, held in place by 3 cables and the safety line. To free the bypass, they would have to lower one end, rotate the full mass parallel to the waterline, and move it through the narrow space beside the grate. There would be no room for haste. There would be very little room for another mistake. Night settled over Pineglass before the team returned to the water. Floodlights stood along the reservoir like pale sentries, their beams crossing the snow-covered shoreline and the dark surface beyond it. The small dam carried a low vibration from the runoff entering through the mountain streams. It could be felt beneath the boots of anyone standing still long enough. Beth Kellen moved between the fire crews and the road team with a folded evacuation map in one hand. Every family below the dam had been warned. Vehicles had been moved from the lowest properties, and barriers waited beside the county road in case the river rose beyond its normal channel. No one had been ordered to leave home yet. That decision depended on what happened in the next few hours. Inside the control room, Mark Dorsey confirmed that the forgotten maintenance line remained closed and isolated from the active system. Red warning tags hung from the valve controls. Mechanical indicators showed the gates in their locked positions, and pressure readings remained stable. Erin Holt checked the operation one final time. She verified the divers' communication lines, the route away from the submerged screen, the lifting cables, the safety line, the location of every valve, and the maximum time Luke Danner and the second diver could remain underwater. She also reviewed the reopening procedure with Mark. Nothing would move through the old bypass until both divers, every tool, and every loose line had been counted on shore. Earl Benton sat at the control table with Hazel beneath his chair. The German shepherd rested her head across his boots, too tired to follow the activity, but unwilling to sleep through it. The brass plumb bob lay beside Earl's old maintenance drawing. Tuck remained in the heated recovery room behind the clinic, far from the lights, winches, and metal sounds that still frightened him. Luke stood at the water's edge, wearing his charcoal dry suit. He could hear the shore crew making final checks behind him. In earlier years, that many voices would have felt like interference. He would have wanted every word reduced to one command, and every decision forced into a single line. Now each voice carried a different part of the truth. Beth knew the people below the dam. Mark knew the gates. Erin knew the limits of the dive. Earl knew the shape of the old lake bottom. Luke knew what waited in the dark. None of them knew enough alone. Erin gave permission to enter the water. Luke descended beside the supporting diver. Their lamps found the guide rope first, then the stone wall leading toward the old screen. The tree trunk remained where the previous test had left it. Its heavier end rested partly in the mud, while the upper section crossed the grate at an angle. 3 cable loops still bound the timber and broken planks together. The new plan required patience. The shore crew would reduce tension on the eastern line, while increasing tension on the northern line. Luke and the second diver would guide the heavier end deeper into the soft lake bottom. Once the trunk's angle lowered, the lines would rotate it until it rested parallel to the old current path. Only then could they move it through the open space beside the screen. Luke checked the retreat route. "Path is clear," he reported. Erin repeated the confirmation so every group heard it. Earl studied the camera image in the control room. He traced the old contour lines with one finger, then told Erin that the mud should be deepest just below the southern edge of the screen. Mark compared Earl's estimate with the modern depth reading. The numbers agreed closely enough to proceed. Erin instructed Beth's winch crews to begin. The eastern line eased first. Luke felt the trunk settle through his gloves. A cloud of brown silt rose from beneath it, swallowing the lower cable for several seconds. He waited until the water cleared before reporting the new position. The northern line tightened. Slowly, the heavy end of the trunk sank into the mud. The upper end lifted away from the grate by a few inches. There was no dramatic break, no sudden release. The mass moved with the stubbornness of something that had spent years resisting water. Luke signaled for another small adjustment. The second diver confirmed that the lower loop remained clear of the screen. Inside the control room, Earl watched the load numbers divide more evenly across the lines. "That is better," he said. "Do not ask one rope to be brave for all the others." Mark glanced toward him, but kept his attention on the gauges. The trunk began to rotate. Its upper end turned toward the open channel beside the grate. A strip of broken bridge plank slipped free and dropped harmlessly into the silt. Luke followed the movement without touching the loaded cables. Then the guideline on the western side slid from its metal groove. It dropped across the trunk and caught beneath a broken branch. Luke saw the problem immediately. The line had not snapped. He could reach it in seconds. A short swim, one pull, one correction, and the operation could continue before the trunk settled into a worse position. His body had already turned when he stopped himself. The old instinct was clear. Act before the situation grew large enough to require permission. Luke looked at the cable, then at the narrow space beyond it. He reported the failure. "Western guide has slipped from the groove. It is caught below the upper branch." Aaron told all winches to hold. The motors stopped. Luke remained where he was. Every part of him knew how quickly he could solve the problem. Waiting felt less natural than moving through the cold. Yet the guideline was connected to people above him who could not see his full position. If he crossed without warning, they might adjust tension while he was beside the trunk. Control had once meant doing everything himself. Now control meant making sure everyone understood what he was about to do. Aaron asked Luke to confirm his exit route. Luke checked the path behind him. "Route remains open." The second diver confirmed the same. On shore, Beth's team shifted the western winch several feet to change the angle of the line. Earl reviewed the old drawing and identified a stone ledge beneath the southern wall where the cable could be held temporarily. Mark verified that the isolation pressure had not changed. Only after each group reported ready did Aaron allow Luke to approach. He moved along the stone wall rather than crossing over the loaded trunk. At the broken branch, he freed the guideline and passed it around the lower side of the obstruction. The second diver secured it near the stone ledge Earl had identified. Luke backed away. "Western guide reset." Aaron ordered a low-tension test. The line held. Something in Luke loosened that had nothing to do with the equipment. He had waited. No one had taken the decision from him. The team had made his decision safer. The work resumed. The northern line increased by small, measured amounts, while the eastern line released. The tree trunk rotated until its length pointed away from the grate. The first cable loop slackened. Luke removed it and guided it clear. The second loop remained tight beneath the lower side of the wood. Earl advised shifting the southern sling a few inches before releasing it. Luke checked the tension with his gauge, confirmed the load change, and removed the cable only after Aaron approved. The third loop was buried partly in the mud. The supporting diver cleared enough silt for Luke to reach it. Together, they lifted the cable free and placed it inside a recovery bag. The trunk was no longer attached to the screen. Beth's crews guided the mass through the open channel beside the grate, moving it away from the bypass and toward a sheltered bank where it could be secured later. Luke swept his light across the old screen. Water did not move through it yet, but the openings were visible. Broken planks and loose cable no longer covered the frame. "Screen is clear," Luke reported. Aaron did not celebrate. She ordered both divers to return. Luke and the second diver followed the guide rope away from the structure. They reached the surface within minutes and climbed onto the snowy dock beneath the floodlights. Aaron counted the two divers first. Then she counted the tools, the camera, the force gauge, the recovered cables, the lifting slings, and each guideline. Only after the final item was confirmed did she enter the control room. "All personnel and equipment are clear," Aaron told Mark. Mark removed the first safety lock and opened the old bypass at its lowest test setting. For several seconds, The gauges changed very little. Then water began moving through the forgotten line. The pressure on the western system fell in a slow, even curve. Mark increased the opening only after Aaron confirmed again that the work zone was empty. The old bypass carried the additional flow without shaking or drawing debris back toward the screen. Outside, water passed through the dam in the direction it had been built to travel. Beth received the downstream report over her radio. The river remained within its banks. The low county road stayed open, and the wooden houses beyond it stood dry beneath the snow. The release had begun on time. No one shouted. The volunteers stood beside the winches, breathing steam into the cold. Aaron rested both hands on the control table. Mark watched the pressure settle into its safe range. Sometimes mercy did not arrive as a miracle that broke the laws of the world. Sometimes it came through people willing to check one more line, hear one more voice, and stop before a small mistake became something a family would remember forever. Earl looked down at Hazel. "I should not have taken the boat out alone," he said. The people nearest him became quiet. Earl explained that fear for the dam had been real, but it had not been his only reason. He had wanted proof that age had not made him a burden. He had broken his promise to Rose and placed Hazel and Tuck in danger because he could not bear the thought of being dismissed. "I called pride responsibility," Earl said. "Rose always knew when I was doing that." Hazel pressed her head more firmly against his leg. Luke had removed his hood, but he still wore the wet, dry suit. He stood across from Earl, water collecting beneath his boots. "I was wrong too," Luke said. The admission came without explanation at first. Then Luke told Earl that he had used safety as a reason to control every choice around him. He had believed the only way to protect people was to limit the chances that they might choose differently. "I kept trying to remove you from the line," Luke said. "I should have helped find the right place for you to hold it." Earl studied him, then gave a tired nod. Mark pulled an empty chair beside the control table. He placed the modern map between himself and Earl. "Will you help me redraw every old route that is missing?" Mark asked. Earl looked at the chair. For once, no one was asking him to prove what he could survive. They were asking what he knew. "I can help," he said. Later, Luke stopped at the clinic before going home. Tuck stood in the far corner of the recovery room when Luke entered. The puppy's ears lowered at the sight of the wet, dry suit and the metal buckles. His small body leaned away. Luke did not approach. He sat on a low bench and began removing his gloves. One slipped from his hand and fell beside his boot. Tuck watched it. The room remained quiet except for the heater and Hazel's breathing from the adjoining space. After a long moment, the puppy stepped forward. He stopped once, looked at Luke, then crossed the remaining distance. Tuck lowered his nose to the glove, caught it carefully between his teeth, and carried it the last few inches. He placed it beside Luke's boot. Then he sat down. Luke did not reach for him. He only rested his hand near the glove and allowed the puppy to decide how close was close enough. The last weeks of winter passed quietly over Pineglass. Snow still covered the mountain slopes, but the village no longer listened to every change in the reservoir with fear. The forgotten maintenance line had carried the release safely, and the water below the dam had remained inside its banks. What changed afterward was less visible. There were no banners for Earl Benton. No one carved his name into the control room wall or pretended that one correct warning erased the danger of taking a boat out alone in winter. Earl still had limits. Dr. Alice Kern visited his cabin every Thursday morning. She checked his breathing, balance, and circulation, then asked questions directly to him rather than speaking over him to whoever happened to be nearby. Alice reminded Earl that he wasn't cleared to work from a boat or stand for long periods beside the frozen reservoir. Earl complained that she repeated herself. Alice answered that repetition was cheaper than another ambulance ride. The difference was not that Earl always agreed. The difference was that the decisions were discussed with him. No one used age as proof that he had lost the right to understand his own life. Hazel recovered beside him. The 6-year-old German shepherd regained weight, and the dark gold fur along her legs grew full again. Most afternoons, she slept beneath Earl's kitchen table, while he spread old maps beside the new ones. Mark Dorsey came twice a week from the dam control station. Aaron Holt joined whenever the dive schedule allowed. Together, the three of them traced forgotten channels, abandoned inspection points, and drainage routes built before electronic records existed. Mark brought a scanner and a stack of labeled folders. Earl insisted they preserve the original pages. "A machine can remember a copy," he told Mark. "It cannot remember why someone made the mark." Mark no longer dismissed sentences like that as an old technician's attachment to paper. He scanned every page, then stored the originals in acid-free sleeves. Pineglass created a small maintenance advisory group that included current workers and retired employees. Their first meetings were held in the fire station because it had the largest coffee pot and the fewest leaking windows. New rules followed. Any pipe or channel removed from an official map had to be verified in the field. Historic records would be digitized, but original notebooks and drawings would remain available. Winter work on the reservoir required at least 2 people, even for routine checks. Knowledge from retired workers would be recorded and tested against modern instruments, rather than ignored or accepted without question. Beth Kellen and the volunteer fire crew also revised the downstream warning plan. Every household near the Low County Road received a simple printed map showing safe routes and contact numbers. None of the changes were dramatic by themselves. That was the point. A community was often protected by ordinary things done before anyone needed to be brave. Luke Danner began visiting Earl's cabin with practical reasons. The storage door needed a new hinge. One of the old maps required a better photograph. A pressure gauge from the former maintenance house had markings Luke wanted Earl to explain. The reasons became thinner as winter continued. Earl noticed, but did not expose him. Luke usually arrived near supper. He would place his gloves beside the wood stove, check the latch on the back door, and sit at the kitchen table while Earl heated soup or stew. Hazel rested near the fire. Tuck slept beneath Luke's chair, his growing paws extending farther into the room each week. Neither man talked much about loneliness. Earl had eaten alone since Rose died. He still set 1 pan on the stove, and sometimes reached for 2 bowls before remembering. Luke had spent years returning to a house where every object remained exactly where he had left it. He had once considered that order peaceful. Now he understood that silence and peace were not always the same thing. Their evenings held no grand confessions. They discussed warped bridge timber, the price of fuel, and whether Mark's new labeling system used too many colors. Earl told short stories about Rose correcting his measurements with a look from across the room. Luke occasionally mentioned men he had served with, but he did not polish those memories into lessons. Some nights they said very little. The wood settled in the stove. Hazel breathed beside Earl. Tuck leaned against Luke's boot. The loneliness did not disappear. It simply stopped belonging to one person at a time. Tuck's fear of Luke's diving equipment faded slowly. At first, the puppy left the room whenever Luke carried the dry suit inside. Later, he remained behind Hazel and watched. Then he began approaching the equipment box after Luke closed it. By February, Tuck often slept beside the tool case. The puppy developed one habit no one had taught him. Whenever Luke dropped a glove, Tuck carried it back and placed it against the box. Then he sat nearby as if waiting for the mistake to be acknowledged. Luke began dropping gloves more often than a careful man should. Earl noticed that too. "You are becoming careless," Earl said one evening. Luke looked at Tuck sitting proudly beside the returned glove. "Age catches everyone." Earl laughed hard enough to cough, then blamed the wood smoke. As Tuck grew, his body began to show the long legs and dark back of an adult German shepherd. His right ear stood straight. The left one remained slightly bent at the tip. He still belonged with Hazel, and Earl was fully capable of caring for both dogs. That mattered to him. One evening, when the snow outside had softened into wet ridges, Earl placed a slate blue leash on the table between them. Luke looked at it, but did not touch it. Earl explained that Tuck had reached the age when a puppy could leave his mother. Hazel had taught him what she could, and Tuck had already chosen where he placed his attention. Luke said Earl did not need to give up one of his dogs. "I am not being made to give up anything," Earl replied. His tone carried enough firmness to stop Luke from turning the moment into another rescue. Earl reminded him that no doctor, neighbor, or committee had decided he was unable to keep Tuck. The choice belonged to Earl. Then he pointed toward the front room. Tuck was lying beside Luke's boots instead of near the stove. During every visit for the past month, the puppy had followed Luke to the door and waited until the truck disappeared down the snowy road. "Sometimes holding on is the selfish part," Earl said. "He has chosen where he wants to grow." Luke looked toward Hazel. The adult shepherd was awake beside Earl's chair. Her amber eyes moved from Tuck to Luke, calm and watchful. Luke finally picked up the leash. "Temporary arrangement," he said. Earl did not argue. Some men needed to approach love from the side, the same way they approached shame. Hazel rose and walked to her puppy. She touched her nose to the top of Tuck's head and stood there for a moment. Tuck leaned into her chest. Then Hazel returned to Earl and lay across his feet. There was no struggle, no one pulling one dog away from another. Hazel remained with the man whose life she had shared for years. Tuck left with the man whose quiet house had made room for him. The two homes were less than a mile apart. Luke brought Tuck back often. By the time spring reached Pineglass, the reservoir had changed color. The hard winter black softened into blue-gray, and thin streams of meltwater shone along the dock. Snow remained high on the upper ridges, but the air carried the clean scent of wet earth and pine bark. The first formal inspection of the spring season brought everyone back to the dam. Earl sat in the control room at the place Mark had made permanent for him. The brass plumb bob rested beside the updated maintenance map, and Hazel lay beneath the table with her head on his boot. Mark stood at the pressure panel, steel-framed glasses low on his nose. Erin checked the dive list, communication equipment, and valve status. Her laminated procedure cards clicked softly against the cobalt carabiner at her belt. Beth watched the shoreline where the volunteer crews had installed new markers above the high water line. Outside on the dock, Luke prepared for the inspection in his charcoal dry suit. Tuck, now larger, but still plainly a puppy, remained beside the equipment box. He watched Luke roll each glove together, check the mask, and secure the communication line. Luke set one glove on top of the box. It slid off and fell to the dock. Tuck stood immediately. The young German shepherd picked up the glove, carried it back, and placed it on the equipment case. Then he sat beside it, his slightly bent left ear turned toward Luke. Luke rested one hand briefly on the puppy's shoulder. He did not promise to return. Tuck did not need the promise spoken. Luke looked through this control room window. Months earlier, he would have checked every detail himself and entered the water when he believed the system was ready. Now he waited. Inside, Earl studied the live readings and compared them with the newly corrected map. He traced the old bypass line, checked the western pressure level, and placed one hand on Hazel's back. Then Earl raised his thumb. Mark confirmed that the system was stable. Erin gave Luke permission to begin. Luke answered with a nod and stepped down the ladder into the cold spring water. Behind him, Erin held the communication line. Mark watched the valves. Beth remained near the shore. Earl monitored the old routes that had finally returned to the map. Tuck lay beside Luke's toolbox, his eyes fixed on the place where Luke had disappeared below the surface. The line between the diver and the shore passed through many hands. No one pulled harder than necessary, no one let go. From that spring forward, no one in Pineglass was expected to hold the whole line alone. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is stop trying to carry every burden alone. Luke, Earl, and the people of Pineglass were saved not by one hero, but by listening, trusting, and giving each person the right place to help. In our own lives, someone beside us may still have wisdom, purpose, or love to offer, even if age, fear, or hardship has made others overlook them. Tell us what this story meant to you in the comments. If stories of loyalty, dignity, and second chances matter to you, please subscribe and join us for the next one. May you always find a steady hand when the weight becomes too heavy to hold alone.